How will you say your role as a psychologist working in the wider area of behavioral economics and as a chief executive of the Behavioral Insight Unit is associated with pensions?
Sure. So before there was the Behavioral Insight team in 2010, there was I also worked for 6 years for Tony Blair in the Prime Minister's Strategy Unit. So that wasn't overtly, with a label as a psychologist or anything else, although actually I did come from Cambridge as a psychologist. So we touched on pensions reform back then, of course, which is when the Turner Commission, Adair's, was running. We can talk more about that. But of course, those reforms didn't actually, they take a long time to come into play. So they didn't actually come into play until I was actually myself back at Number 10 again in 2010 for what was then became the Behavioural Insights team. And so in 2012 is when we actually implemented the reforms. So I possibly unusually, I was actually there when we were having some of the early discussions about pensions in the Blair administration, and then there later in the Cameron administration when we did actually implement.
Do you agree that Pensions Commission managed to achieve a wide and long-term consensus?
It did pretty broadly, I think, yes. My own view is that I was a one remove, I should say, from the Pensions Commission, although I did send, I think, a rather key paper to Adair about auto-enrolment, which I can tell you about if you want. I personally think it was a good model of public consultation. In fact, one of the reasons why I feel that in the 2010 administration, which, remember, as I said, was a different government completely, and the Prime Minister had serious reservations about auto-enrolment, one of the reasons why we were able to keep the reforms going and have them in place was because right from the beginning Adair had done a very, very good consultation, an unusually good and sophisticated consultation, I would say. And I sometimes say actually what it in effect did is that by showing the evidence to the public and large samples of it, they gave us permission to make the change. The public, when shown the evidence, like on auto-enrolment, said, well, wouldn't it be better to do it the other way around? So it created political licensing in order to make the change. And in fact, it's a model which has got, I think, much wider implications that we should do more consultations around, genuine, deep consultations around some of the contentious issues around big lifestyle decisions or decisions with the public. And it would create the same dynamic of licensing politicians, government to go further than otherwise they think they would be able to.
Do you think that behavioral economics ideas helped or added to build this consensus?
Well, there was a very specific piece of evidence which absolutely did. I assume you're talking to Adair and he can tell you what it looked like on the other side, but I can tell you quite precisely the chain of events that led to us to push it. Unusually, I think precisely what happened is that this was back in around 2002, must have been 2001, 2002, in this early part of this the second Blair premiership, when Tony had been re-elected and whatever. And of course this was also the period when the Adair Commission ran, and there was work going on inside the Strategy Unit 2 on the pensions reform. So that was the kind of general background to it. So around that time, Danny Kahneman, this is before he had the Nobel Prize, was going to be around, and I'd email with him and say, so if he was in London, come in. And so he came in and we had a chat. There was Danny there was me, there was Jeff, I think maybe Stephen Aldridge sat in, I can't remember. But basically we just sat around the table and we were discussing what we would now call behavioural economics. Actually, Danny always hated calling it behavioural economics because he thinks it's psychology, and economists keep getting the credit when they probably don't deserve it. So we were talking with Danny, and I said he wasn't a well-known figure then as he is now because it was before the Nobel Prize, and we were discussing it, and of course I knew his work from Cambridge and Tversky and Kahneman. And towards the end of this conversation I was saying to Danny, by the way, what do you think is really interesting? What do you think the most interesting stuff that you've seen about policy applications? And remember, Danny's not really a policy wonk, he's a psychologist and would remain the case. And this was in the context, of course, of a paper which we were writing at the time about behaviour change, personal responsibility and behaviour change, which for Strategy Unit we then published actually around, I can't remember, 2002, 2003. So it was before that. Anyway, so Danny says, actually, there's the really interesting bit of work which he thinks is very, very significant, which hasn't really got any profile yet, which is particularly linked to this guy called Dick Thaler, and he's written this very interesting piece, which hasn't got any circulation yet, but it was a draft paper at that time, mainly, on libertarian paternalism, as it was called. You'll recognise the phrase. And he thinks it's really interesting and it's got some real policy implications. So specifically, Danny Kahneman, in that conversation, alluded to this early draft of the libertarian paternalist paper and work, and of course Save More Tomorrow. So I remember after that meeting I went and looked up the paper and got hold of it. I didn't actually know Richard Thaler at that time, and thought it was really interesting, very neat, this demonstration of the Save More Tomorrow and the kind of blah blah blah, and the bigger argument about libertarian paternalism. So a couple of things followed from it. We did, of course, lay out some of those ideas in the behaviour change paper, which was published at that time. There's a whole backstory to how that played out, which wasn't all pretty. But I remember specifically thinking, it's obviously got such direct implications for the Turner Commission. I remember taking a copy of the paper, and I literally stuffed it in an envelope and scribbled a note on top of it for Adair and said, Adair, I think this might be the most important paper that you'll read on pensions reform in the whole commission. So I scribbled this note, I think on number 10 paper, if I remember right, stuffed it in the envelope and stuck it in the post to Adair. So I didn't then talk to him about it in a lot more detail, and he may well also have picked it up from other sources, but that was the point at which, certainly within central government, when I and others were first aware of this work and sent it to Adair, and of course, as it were, the rest is history. But maybe he was sent it from 5 other people. I doubt it, because it was quite obscure at that time.
Would you describe the introduction of automatic enrolment in the UK as a behavioural economic success story?
Yes, for sure. I mean, in many ways, it's the most successful. It's not only the UK, of course, 401k in a limited scale we're doing in the US. Yeah. Actually, people tend to forget, but New Zealand did a pretty similar version a couple of years before, which we looked at with interest, because you could see, they underpredicted, it was so effective, they underpredicted the effect sizes. So yes, I think it's clearly one of the biggest successes, not only in the numbers of people, which again, you'll know, we just passed 10 million people in the estimate for extra savers, but the relative effect size. So even, in fact, when we first work was being done on it, we didn't know as well as I think we later did about the effect size. So particularly Raj Chetty's work, looking at the impact and the effectiveness of a tax subsidy. So that's why it's not only is it very effective, in fact so effective that one of the arguments we were having after the 2010 administration is the department underestimating how effective it would be, but also that if you take Raj's estimate from Denmark, if a tax subsidy gives you for every pound only a penny of extra saving concentrated in 15% of the population, and we are literally spending tens of billions a year still on it, it's so expensive for so little return, versus changing the default gets us this 10 million. I mean, it's just astonishingly better, and it has become the poster boy within behavioural economics, or behavioural science in general, of a policy application. Because it's not just that it's effective alongside a pretty precise estimate of the extraordinary ineffectiveness of the previous mechanism. So it's like a beautiful test of conventional economics meets behavioural economics, and it wipes the floor, one with the other. So that's why it has this additional, I think, power in the literature and amongst behavioural science today. It stands very powerfully against conventional economics as a comparison. It's now been replicated in multiple locations. It's an incredibly powerful. Even if you're doing for the last 10 years, certainly the last, a presentation on behavioural science applied to policy, it's been the one that is one of the most obvious examples you would start with, right? Because it's all there, it's got it all. It's no longer the only example, by any means. I mean, the Behavioural Insight team alone, we have run, I don't even know anymore, I've lost track, more than 500 trials I think we've initiated in many, many areas, as well as intervened on a lot of different policy areas. BIT alone, let alone other BI teams as they've grown across the world. I mean, we worked in more than 30 countries last year on issues ranging from, of course, tax, a classic one, many places, education, environment, corruption, improved governance, reducing crime, stopping a war, market design, consumer behavior. So there are now a very, very large number of examples, some of which are comparable in scale to the original pensions example.
So in addition to the evidence brought by behavioral economics, do you think that there should be specific institutional features? Let's take the example of UK. That should be there for allowing the implementation or the adoption of behavioral change in policy?
Yeah, look, we built the Behavioural Insights team after 2010 deliberately in order to institutionalise and drive forward the use of behavioural science, not just as a one-off in pensions, but if it works in pensions, because basically a more nuanced account of human behaviour takes you to different kinds of policy solutions, just as it did in pensions. By the way, in pensions, it's not just auto-enrolment, there are a number of other things, but anyway, then why not everything else? That was the question that was posed, if you like, by the creation of a team in Number 10 in 2010. We found it was highly effective. I think we learned a lot about how to spread and adopt that practice, and not only, many other policy areas since. Of course, it's spread into many other parts of the world. As I said, we are hosting, for example, behavioural science, an annual event which moves between countries, which we set up a few years ago, this year in London in September. When I just last looked, we're nearly 6 months away from before we already have more than 60 countries coming to it, policymakers and so on. So we've gone a hell of a long way since 2010 in terms of the geographical spread, the topic base. So what is the implication? Well, yes. Do you create specialist expertise in government? Sure. Do you early on have to create specialist teams? Yes. Maybe we'll reach the point where you don't need specialist teams because it's just this kind of thing. Any public servant should have a good understanding of behavioural science. It should just be absolutely core to public service delivery and design. Should there be other institutional features that sit alongside it? So in my view, yes. I mean, we've always said, you can read Inside the Nudge Unit, we sometimes say, because we often get asked and we help other governments do this, what are the key components to it? And we have this little simple mnemonic, apples, but the beginning of it is administrative support and capability, but also political support. So there is, partly because a lot of behavioural science tends to concern often lifestyle choices, if you conclude it is actually quite a powerful technique, that brings with it the politics of, who nudges the nudgers? So that raises both questions about political licensing and is there support to do these things in order to be adopted, but also more subtle issues in my view, and I'm on record for it for a long time, which is my view that governments that want to do this should be open about it, but also my view we should go further in an answer to the who nudges the nudgers, which is that I believe we should use more deliberative mechanisms where you show the public and you say, look, we think these are the effects that are operating here. How do you think the default should be set? Like in the example of pensions. So we know that what's by the checkout in the supermarket is very, very powerful. It's affecting behaviour. What do you think? Should we regulate? Should we change the rules to say you can't have chocolate by a checkout, or should you not? My own view on the politics of it is we do have a slight difference between our North American cousins on this one, which is that in the US it's very much framed as nudge techniques should always be choice enhancing, right? So that's why auto-enrollment also illustrates that. You don't take away the option and the choice to whether you can say no if you don't want to save the extra. In that sense, it's seen as choice enhancing, or at least not choice reducing. That's actually a relatively narrow take. So we've gone much broader in the use of behavioural science. There are many areas where you can change the choice architecture in ways that are very, very powerful, and whether you like it or not, someone's going to be doing that. But that may or may not increase choice, or may not be transparent. And so to say it's choice enhancing isn't, in my view, an adequate response, because it is so widely used. It has so many applications to introduce a more nuanced account of human behaviour and work out what would be more effective in policy terms, that choice enhancing, where people often don't even see the choice, isn't enough. And so we should at least escalate it to say of our citizens, collectively, what do you choose? Collectively, how do you how would you like to shape the influences on your behavior and that of others in this world, be it from social media to all kinds of other policy areas you might want to think on, right? So that's not everyone's view, but it's certainly my view that you should buttress the use of these techniques with stronger public accountability of a certain kind.
What approaches do you imagine using that people can choose who will nudge them and when?
I mean, a key insight, remember, is that a lot of the choices and decisions which we are making thousands every day, most of which on a pretty automatic basis. That's the whole point about it. So we make the decision, but actually it's a kind of almost, if you like, our unconscious, our fast brain is making those decisions. So what would it mean? And to every time it's like, oh, wait a minute, here's a choice here. What do you want to decide? Like, oh my God, our lives would be unbearable, right? So whether we like it or not, are in the world of choice architecture. So the question is, what does that mean for citizens? I mean, a good current example is around evolving markets, social media, and digital behavior, where these techniques are being very widely used by market players, right, to capture your attention, to keep you scrolling, to get you to look as many adverts as possible, and so on. These look a lot like nudges, and often, by the way, they're using the same experimental approaches. Remember, one of the things that BIT has certainly brought into government and has helped spread across the world is a very strong form of empiricism, of testing, trialing, seeing what's more effective. Well, governments aren't the only ones doing this. It's being done elsewhere. So social media is clearly a very powerful force, actually, and often for good in our world, but also it has bad effects too. What would that mean to say? Who would choose and when? So, well, you could decide, I'm never going to use Facebook. That's true, but actually for a lot of people, it's a part of your life now, right? So it's not a very meaningful choice. So then it comes into all the other choices that will come from it. There are, of course, built into it many design features. In principle, you can give some of the control back to the user and with toggles and say, I know, for example, as not just on the hardware as well as the software, should it be that I'm only able to use Facebook or whatever for half an hour, and after half an hour it'll switch off and I'll have to go for a walk and do something else for 5 minutes, right? So you can design toggles. In principle, you can design it to give the control back to the individual. So if that's true, how would it happen? Even the design of the toggles becomes relevant. This is the thing, right? Where is it? Is it on the front, or is it several menus down? So there are all these choices, some of which can be given back to the individual. But one of the reasons why it's quite deep and it applies from pensions to many of these other issues is it's when the individual's preference is not such a simple thing to answer. So is it the express preference is when you're on your phone and you're scrolling and you're spending the hours? Well, that's what you want then, because you're spending your time doing it. So your express preference and moment by moment we know is driven often by, shortcuts, mental biases, etc. But of course you've got some agency. But the choice which you would make, not in the moment, but if I said to you, put your phone away, let's talk about how much time you'd like to spend on your phone doing what, you would probably give a different set of preferences than the ones that are revealed in your actual direct behavior moment by moment. Similarly, if we got you together with your family and your neighbors and we said, how much time do you think should we all spend on social media versus having dinner with each other, you might reach another conclusion again. So you've got these different levels of preference, and you've got similarly corollary different points of access around individual choice retoggles or saying yes or no, but also choice between platforms if your markets are functioning well. What's the pressures, what's the collective forces? So on social media, some of the big platforms often talk about, the community. It's not obvious the sense in which the community gets to really collectively come together and say, hey, this is what we'd like the social media platform to do, and have the limits on it, including self-limits of various kinds. So when you disaggregate it, there are lots of other further questions about design choices, which also go into simultaneously, just to be clear, one of the key things about behavioral science nowadays, I think people often think of nudging is individual things like the individual act of auto-enrollment. It's never just that. It's as well the spillover effects, the market design, the wider ramifications. So we are simultaneously often moving backwards and forwards between the individual level behavior and the market dynamic, right? to work out how they come together, and indeed often talk about double or treble nudges. So we move enough marginal consumers to change the market pressure, the market changes its behaviour, which in turn shapes the behaviour of the consumers.
Some have argued that behind these nudges there is manipulation of people's weaknesses like myopia, inertia, or emotions.
Yeah.
So how you will respond to the criticism of manipulation?
Yeah. Well, this technology can clearly be used to manipulate, right? Like any other, right? Strong forms of persuasion. What's the point at which persuasion moves into manipulation? The implication is generally that you're getting someone to do something they don't really want to do, or it's got malevolent purpose to it. So what are the responses to that? Cass and Richard would say, Cass Sunstein and Richard Thaler would, in a North American context, that's one of the reasons why they go back to nudges should be choice enhancing, because that gives you a buffer against manipulation, that they should be transparent and so on. I said that's a good starting point. There are quite severe limits to how far that takes you, because certainly the transparency, that they're all around you now, these cues and influences, and you can become more aware of them. That's true. But these techniques, let's just be straightforward about it. They can, like any other form of knowledge, they can be used for good or for bad. So the gambling industry is rich with incredibly sophisticated and often relatively overt use of behavioral science. You go to a Vegas casino, it is, in some sense a masterpiece of behavioral science. Remove cues of daylight, make sure you're in a big room, so wherever you are, you hear someone winning, so it changes your estimates. The ability by the industry to work out what pain points are for individuals. Like literally, what's your pain point, to work out what's the point at which you're about to lose so much money you'll walk out and not come back. Intervene at that point, hey, come and have a drink, come have a meal, blah, 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 in order to... So it's impressive in some sense. Does it increase the net, well-being of humanity? Probably not. Is it the actual choice if you said to people, is this really what you want or is it not? For some it might, but often it would not. Clearly this gets back to, therefore, what's the role of government and what are the constraints and how is it used? So BIT, for example, it was in government, it's now a social purpose company. Written into our articles is we only can do stuff which clearly is intended to and likely to have a positive social impact. We're a social impact, social purpose vehicle. Now, should you extend that more generally, right? Or do you put other kinds of constraints? So, you can try and put these things, I guess, in lots of levels. You can try and do it in the individual level by make it choice enhancing and transparent where you can. You can't always do that. You can at least then have, this is what regulations and other have to do. You have to work out what are the limits to acceptability or not. But otherwise, also, you can try and say, what are the governance arrangements that sit around these kinds of approaches to make sure that they're used for good or for bad, and for us to decide, right? How do 15-year-olds get to shape social media in the way that they want it, as opposed to the way that it is? How do they get to shape the forces that are in turn shaping them? And if it's transparent and they're choosing it, is that manipulation? We will sometimes. Do we self-manipulate? When I say, the chocolate, I'm going to not leave it on the side. I'm going to put it in a cupboard in a tin on the top. I'm actually kind of imposing a constraint or manipulate on myself. The same you might say on some savings behaviours. People will do this, but the key question is, where is their agency in that story, individually and collectively? And let's try and get that right.
How you can control unintended consequences or externalities, so that you make sure that you serve these purposes?
We can't do all of it. By the way, remember that's true for all policy. Yeah. All policy, you have to ask the same set of questions of what are the unintended consequences and blah, blah, blah. And policymakers also have to be realistic. And actually, one of the key lessons for me of this stuff is humility, is to realize that we tend to be overconfident as policymakers about what will work and what won't. And, we think, hey, we've got a great idea to fix this country. We'll go and send an army and do the following. And then it doesn't always work out how we planned. So let's just bear in mind that is not only about this form, it is about others. Our own approach, of course, is not all have followed the same route, but we, unlike to some extent certainly the early take in Washington, is we went down the route of being extremely empirical. So we literally run randomized controlled trials wherever we can. Ideally, you try and look for what are the spillover effects, partly because they're captured in it, and also you look at what are the unintended consequences. So for example, there was a lot of interest, we certainly followed it in a lot of detail, around spillover effects on saving behavior. If the auto-enrollment was leading someone to put money into a pension, where at the same time they're borrowing money from Wonga and paying 1,000%, that's not a good outcome, right? We haven't improved their utility. So it matters as to what it's leading to in displacement. Similarly, as I said, it's not only about individual behavior. If you're interested in behavior, you have to also understand the overall equilibrium effects. So, you're looking at those effects. I mean, an example on pensions would be, we intervened and did work on the pensions passport, a trial where you may remember firms were required to send people at the point of maturity when they could buy an annuity, information about their pension. And they would send these so-called wake-up packs, which no one ever seemed to read. So almost no one was switching. So we designed an intervention, which was a randomized controlled trial, where if we add onto the front of this pack a one-side summary of the pension, would more people then click through and find out information about alternatives? It increased it by more than tenfold. That sounds good. On the other hand, it's like tenfold. It went from about 1% to a little over 10%, But the question is, and I raise it here, is that it's not just about the individual behavior. One of the key things about when you start to get to 10% plus, it means that the company now has to also think, boy, we might actually lose some market share. So it can put pressure on the companies to change their behavior and offer better products, and it can change the market equilibrium. So in this case, you're actually getting positive spillover effects, because if it means that companies are then offering better products and better service because they've got the prospect of moving. See what I mean? So that's why it gets that much more interesting. So we said we look at randomized controlled trials, but actually we're also looking at it at multiple levels to try and get some kind of estimate of the net benefit or cost.
Why soft compulsion was more appropriate for the UK?
One of the things I think we were right not to do is go down a Swedish model of you then have to choose. And then we know people were making very bad choices about their pension plans. So what are the defaults again, and how are they set for who? There are interesting questions around smart defaults, as they're sometimes called. So for example, if you're a very, very heavy smoker, or you've got some kind of genetic illness which means you're quite likely to die young, then actually the default option may not be your best one at all, right? So, and it's not smart enough to distinguish between that. But in principle, it could do that. Are there other choices and built into the design? Absolutely. You mentioned auto-escalation as well. It's got much less attention, but is absolutely key to the design over time. Auto-escalation has, of course, now kicked in. There was real concern amongst many quarters, as there was in the original auto-enrollment, that, it wouldn't work and we have to run big advertising campaigns. And our view was like, calm down, I think you're going to find it's pretty effective. And I think we're seeing the same on auto-escalation. A lot of industry players terrified about it. There are actually even more refined ones which people maybe are less aware of. So we did quite a lot of work with some of the pensions regulators around, if you think about the details of what it means for auto-enrollment, actually someone still has to do stuff, particularly around small employers. Will the employer comply? Will they actually do the paperwork that is necessary for someone, or will they not? And so in fact there was a lot of work that was done, including actually quite good trials, in my view, to test which letters would be more effective to prompt employers, to encourage them to do the work that they needed to do, and so on, as well as take out all the other kinds of frictions we could. So there, in fact, beyond the auto-enrollment, there are a whole lot of other both choice architecture questions and design details which have been very consequential to its success, I would say.
In terms of the political economy of the UK, as a liberal market economy, do you think that there is a link between nudging interventions, in particular this soft compulsion with the choices behind, and the political economy of the UK?
Yeah, well, clearly you can say that. If there's, and certainly it's also true for the US. I mean, one of the things about the choice-enabling take on it is it makes sense in a US context especially. I mean, a very simple question is, do you trust government? If you don't trust government, then why do you trust government to set this default or choice, right? So there are many other governments in the world where trust in government is much higher, or distrust in other players, like commercial players, is also much lower, and therefore the argument is tilted in a different way in terms of what should be done. So I think there's just general presumption in individualistic countries and/or ones which have lower trust in government is you can expect people to say, you know, as individuals they'd like to retain more of the choice. But it's worth bearing in mind that the US actually is the outlier in that sense. There's actually, in fact, there's a graph in the back of inside the Nudge Unit on international comparisons, which I think is kind of salient, where this is a bundle of things around government should ban, you know, strongly support or tend to support. So this is going beyond your average soft nudge. And what percentage of people say that's you agree to these kind of, this is a sort of a bundle of things. And there's the US right at the bottom. Actually, people forget, but Sweden actually is also quite down there. Although you might argue it's because people see that Swedish government has already done so much, they're reluctant to doing more, you know, and so on. There's the UK, we're kind of third from the bottom. But there are lots of other countries, and sometimes people will be surprised by some of those countries, you know, India and so on at the top, pretty high, where there's enormous government support in the public for the government to take stronger lines on things. Now, sometimes that may be because people feel like it's actually unregulated Wild West and they want the government to take more assertive action. It can be that, or it can also be because you trust the government. So there's clearly an interaction with the political context. And one thing, you didn't ask it, but maybe sits behind it. And how does it interact with the politics? So again, inside Nudge Unit, I talked about, and I touched on it earlier, when we did the paper in the Blair administration on behaviour change, it tanked politically because it was really seen as nanny state. So for a government which was already seen and positioned itself as expanding the role of the state in terms of expenditure, expanding the role of the state in terms of more regulation and so on, and Tony was pretty good into thinking up new laws and rules and so on, and now you want to do this stuff as well, so it was interpreted very negatively. So it's interesting that it was Cameron and the centre-right administration which really embraced this technique. But again, it's situated kind of politically in the context of a government which has got no money, is trying to reduce expenditure, it's got a structural deficit of 8%, and it is generally deregulatory in its dynamic. So it's looking at an alternative to regulation, right? So that positions it very differently than it ends up positioning under centre-left administration. And I think that helps to explain why, at least in a UK context, it's in the post-2010 period that this really takes off in a much, much bigger way.
Where you will draw the boundary between traditional approaches like regulation, legislation, etc., and behavioral interventions, will you say that, given that somebody might say that they both compel us to behave in a certain way, so where is the boundary between the two?
So here's the difference between, I think, how we took it forward in the UK and in quite a number of other countries subsequently as we've helped other countries, versus its American origins. So in the US, partly because of the political context, there's a lot of effort to turn it into define nudging almost in opposition to regulatory approaches, to pricing, to sanctions. It's a choice-enabling thing, a particular tool. That actually isn't how we've used it. We have partly used it that way in the UK, but we've actually used it in a slightly different way, which is to say, even though everyone calls it the Nudge Unit, it's the Behavioural Insights team, which is to say, what happens if we introduce to policy making a more realistic model of human behaviour? How would it take us to a different place? So some of that is traditional nudges, but just as much as that is, well, if you are going to use a financial incentive, how do you retailor this financial incentive to make it more impactful, right? If you are going to regulate, and sometimes you will regulate, remember, of course, even auto-enrollment actually requires regulation, but how would you make a regulation, given we're in a world of human beings, not econs, that are likely to be effective and acceptable and less effortful, right? So we are, in that sense, it's a bigger and more general agenda, where actually it's not nudges here and blah blah blah. It's a cross-cutting technique in any tool you're going to use. It's saying, actually, if we think about this for real human beings, how would we reshape it? So just to use a simple example of a financial incentive, which is sometimes like, here's a nudge, here's a financial incentive. No, behavioral science, how can it make your incentive more effectively? So, I don't know, it's a kind of silly example, but if you want disadvantaged students to go to university, should you apply the grant or your scholarship evenly across 3 years, or would it be more effective to say, no, we'll give much more in the first year and then we'll taper it back for the same amount of money, because the most important thing is they should go and try it, then get exposed to the experience, and then actually, how do I feel about that? And then, which would be more effective, right? Yeah. Or to take a mixed recent example is the use of the sugar levy. The sugar levy was really based on quite hard behavioral science. It's been a long time trying to work out what influenced consumers' behavior around sugar and so on, versus getting them to exercise and all the rest of it. We conclude that actually consumers don't notice. They notice a little bit. You can do some stuff on labeling, but essentially what we're trying to do is work out what's the price elasticity, how much consumers respond to different price signals. We conclude, by the way, it's non-linear for lots of reasons, because of lots of factors about actual behavior. We're then trying to work out how many consumers do we have to move and what price point, which would then change the market equilibrium, in the sense that it means retailers would then make different decisions, which would then drive producers to change their production, which is exactly what we see. So with the introduction of the sugar levy, a lot of work on the design of it, the 2-level, where they're designed in relation to the market structure and so on, designed as what we call a double nudge to move enough consumers, or make it likely they would do so, that it basically drives reformulation. And that's of course what it does. So before a penny of sugar levy is paid, we see 11% reduction in levels of sugar in British drinks. And then of course the beauty of it is, for the inert consumers who didn't change their behavior, they go and buy their lemonade or their whatever just as before, but now it's got less sugar in it. So, but that's kind of rooted in the fact that we know that most consumers are inert, but we've designed it with the whole behavioral, equilibrium, ecology in mind. So is that a nudge anymore? Well, it's using more realistic models of human behavior in these different levels to have a better account of how a market functions, including behaviorally based market failure, and just have better policy, period, right? So it's good news, bad news. Behavioral science has broken out of the nudging box into many other areas to be reapplied, to rework other kinds of tools to make them more effective.
Have you done any work on how to nudge employers to accept the auto-escalation or to comply with auto-enrollment?
Yes, and we published some of that. I won't give you, but as I mentioned earlier, so a lot of detailed work was done on the whole script. I mean, if you think about what happens, particularly with small employers, they have to prepare, they had to do a whole number of things before. So we tested with the pensions regulators different letters, different scripts to see which were more effective, online, written, and adjusted and tuned it. So breaking it down, for example, into small steps, doing it in advance in certain kinds of ways to make it easier to lower the frictions, but also to nudge, encourage as many as we could to get them on the right track. And then, of course, use feedback loop around that as well. So yes, absolutely, it was done that, and that's actually in the public domain. This is one of the things about, I think people think about the individual behaviour which we're nudging, whereas a lot of contemporary, if you like, cutting-edge behavioural science, certainly inside government, it's, of course, you're interested in the individual behaviour, but the individual is not the only player. There are many others. I mean, Cass has used the phrase about when you nudge often, there are lots of market players who will nudge back, often quite assertively. So you're trying to understand their behaviour, their incentives, what's driving it, and of course that's an absolutely key thing. I mean, a recent example on companies overtly would be the gender pay gap. So gender pay gap was regulations required to publish certain of this stuff, but it's both because that's intended to have an effect, but even how do you get companies to publish? There were very, very few sanctions on any company which didn't publish. So we used a deliberate series of kind of nudges, encouragements, including publication, highlighting when it's happening, how many firms have already signed up, and so on and so on. And probably against expectation, you know, it was an overwhelming success in terms of the publication rate of firms complying, you know, with publishing the gender pay gap.
Would you like to add anything else?
It's one thing, I realise you're going to look at what's the history of it, but it's equally interesting to say, well, what next? Yeah. You didn't really ask. So, of course, auto-escalation kicks in and so on. Okay. You know, and then particularly given the incredibly long lag, you think about you going from 2001, 2002, it's a decade before it comes in, let alone, you know, that's quite a long cycle. So one of the questions is how can you accelerate it? And in relation to fintech and financial behaviour, there are many other further questions. And one of the things people ask is, well, what's the next auto-enrolment? What's the next thing that would really make a difference? Of course, you can ask that more generally, but you can also ask it more specifically. We haven't got time to go into lots of examples. Obviously, I think it's an important question to ask. But one high on the list will be around rainy day savings. So rainy day savings, we think, is a really important issue. We think that there's some very interesting work in contemporary behavioural science around the tunnelling effects that happen, the negative effects, cognitive effects, as well as economic risks that are associated with being cycling in low-level debt. So there's at least 8 million people in Britain cycling in low-level debt. It not only exposes them to higher levels of risk for economic shock. You know, if your car breaks down, then are you at risk of not being able to drive to work and you lose your job? So it compounds shocks, right? Yeah. And those themselves, of course, are bad for the economy as well as for the individuals. But it's also the more subtle effects that appear to occur. So people in, I don't know how much behavioural science you follow yourself, it's popularised in the book Scarcity, but from Eldar Shafir's work and so on. But the people in debt seem to make, if you like, bad decisions. Your mind is preoccupied with other things. You just try and solve the immediate problem. In fact, some of that evidence has been lying around a long time. Probably when Nick Pearce was around or in government before, there was interest and help to explain or drive the interest in baby bonds, which was that the evidence in longitudinal data that when people had even small amounts of saving in the household, the teenagers, for example, seemed to make better choices in schools. So there's now lots of other evidence around that. So if that's true, then it raises the question of, well, how could we help lift 8 million people out of cycling and low-level debt into low level of saving? How would the world be different for them individually, as well as the positive spillover effects of having generally most people having £1,000, you know, albeit moving up and down of rainy day savings? So that looks behaviourally a very promising thing to look at. It then raises the question of how does that sit alongside auto-enrolment? So for us, again, somebody who's in low-level debt, why are they saving for a pension? Why wouldn't they get themselves out of the low-level debt? So how will they integrate together? Can you use some of the same techniques? So sometimes what's called sidecar savings. Should it be that actually the early savings go into a rainy day savings fund, which people have got much more fluid access into, rather than just a pension fund? And then when you reach that level, does it go into, that would be an example. Or indeed, how can you stimulate the fintech market? It's not just the individual behaviour, you have to say, how do you move the market players? And what would it take in relation to that? And what do good products look like? So for example, I mean, we are doing work with what was the Money Advice Service and now as a single guidance body on a lot of issues with financial behaviour. But one of them is definitely this around trying to encourage, first through lab work to see what's more effective, but also then to translate it into a market. So a simple example would be, we know from work going way back, is that people will often voluntarily, and paradoxically from a classical economic point of view, take constraints that would access, you know, they put some money into an account which they can't easily get back out. Like, well, why would you do that? And even with the same interest rate, people will voluntarily, because we're self-nudging, we're aware of it, right? Well, what would more sophisticated versions of that look like? So an example would be, you put money into a savings product, well, how do you make it more salient what you're saving for? Wonderful work in India from Dilip Soman on saving. You might know about when you give wages back, if instead of giving it in one envelope, you give it in 2 envelopes, you're much more likely to save, much more likely. If one of the envelopes got a picture of your kids on it, even more effective. Your kid's picture, which you have to tear through, even more effective, you know. Well, fine, that works in India. Well, why can't you do that in fintech? So we're doing some work with some providers around why don't you have people able to put money into an account and they can choose what it's for and they can put a picture on it and a purpose, and if they want to break out of it, fine, then what's the right friction? Do you have to kind of click an electronic set of scissors which would tear up the picture of your kids in order to get the money back out? Or do you do it with a social commitment device where you'd say, you can have this money back anytime you like, but it works with two things. One is there's a, take your pick, you set it for yourself even if you want, 3-day, a 1-week delay, and a text message has to go to someone who you choose. So a text message might go to your mum, where it says like, oh, and then she can call you up and say, whoa, you're taking out £500 from your saving. Is everything okay? So you see what I mean? It is possible to design products and services, and one of the interesting questions is, why doesn't the market deliver that? In which case, what do we have to do to nudge the market, right, or wider policy, to deliver better products and services? So in that sense, I think and I hope that the auto-enrollment turns out to be actually just the first step into a world where you introduce, for ourselves as well as for government, and fintech players, a better understanding of human behaviour to help people shape a world which they want, and that helps people do the things that they want to achieve in their lives as well. That applies in relation to an expansion for actually even for savings and fintech, but it applies when you get beyond that into all the other choices in life, about market functioning and eating more healthily, or seeing your kids more often, or the nature of social media, or save the planet, or get on, reach social cohesion, stop a war. I mean, it turns out almost every policy issue you look at, guess what? It's got human beings involved in it. So introducing this more realistic model can give you new levers, often at lower marginal effects. So I think, auto-enrollment has got this kind of key place in the history books as an early thing, but actually what's really interesting is to look forward and say, where does that take us, and what's the possibility? I honestly think, that's a concluding comment, say, I think and I hope that our kids and our grandchildren will look back and just say, well, how the hell did you used to do it? You used to do policy based on these weird models of human behaviour, which you knew were wrong even at the time, number one. And then number two, you just would make policy up, by the way, because you were overconfident human beings, particularly at senior level. Why the hell did you do that? Why weren't you running tests and trials and all the time? The new Green Book, if you read it, is don't just do an evaluation at the end. Basically, it says, no, what you should do, any policy area, is try multiple variations, empirically test them, see which works best, and then do it again and again and again and again. So my own view is that the legacy, I hope, of behavioural science will be, it's much broader than, certainly more broader than nudges, because it's introducing this thinking more generally, and it's also brought in its wake, maybe ultimately even more important, is it's dragged into policy a kind of humility, because of the complexity of human behaviour, and with it therefore an incredibly strong form of empiricism, right? And that's a game changer in its own right.